Hello, welcome everyone. We're just going to let people trickle in a little bit here. We'll start in a few moments. As you can tell, we're all in very sunny places right now. Hope you are enjoying some sun wherever you are. I think we can get started. Welcome to A Little Help from My Friends, working with emergency service providers. My name is Greg Stewart. I'm the Education Programs Manager at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, or CCAHA as we call it, and I use he and they pronouns. So today we're kind of talking about basically working with vendors, as I mentioned, and generally we say the best laid collections emergency plans aren't complete without a list of people and organizations that can be called on to help in the event of a disaster, especially as the potential for natural disasters increase with climate change. We at the Conservation Center are one of those resources, but what about other emergency planning and recovery vendors? If your organization is in need of services like large-scale dehumidification, vacuum freeze drying, or serious mold remediation, do you know who to call and what should you expect? So I'll be joined by CCAHA Preventive Conservator Maddie Cooper and Polygon Director of Client Development Matt DeCirce in a conversation about working with emergency service providers. Matt's going to start with a quick presentation and then we'll move right into Q&A. And so this is really a chance for you to ask questions of him and of Maddie about what it's like to do this work. So just some Zoom housekeeping. You are in Zoom webinar, which means your video and audio are turned off, but you can ask questions or make comments to us in the chat. This program is auto closed captioned in English, and you can turn on subtitles with the little CC button in the Zoom toolbar. So like I say, we'll have a presentation from our speakers followed by a Q&A, but you're certainly welcome to drop your questions in the chat at any time, and I will be the one reading those questions out towards the end. We are recording today, and we'll send a recording as well as the PowerPoint and any other resources in a follow-up email. And I want to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities, the William Penn Foundation, and the Independence Foundation, who are making today's program possible and are allowing it to be free for everybody. So just one quick note about the organization I work for. So at the center, we are a regional conservation lab and preservation services facility. We're based in Philly, but we work with organizations and clients all across the country. Our conservators treat paper-based objects like books, photographs, documents, artwork on paper, and more. And our preservation services staff work in the field, providing education programs and helping institutions plan for the future of their collections. The center also offers a wide range of digitization services, as well as fundraising assistance, housing and framing, and more. And you can learn more about what we do on our website, ccaha.org. So just a little bit about our speakers. In her position as Preventive Conservator, Maddie Cooper works with both preservation services and conservation departments to carry out preservation surveys and assessments for museums, libraries, archives, and community collections, and to work on treatment projects requiring preventative care. And she'll be kind of serving as our moderator today. She's going to have some questions at the ready just to kind of get things started. And Matt DeCirce has 12 years of employment with Polygon US Corporation and 20 years of experience in the disaster recovery industry. At Polygon, Matt is currently the Director of Client Development for the East region. He has supervised and managed numerous mitigation and remediation contracts, including contracts and master service agreements for the state of Connecticut, state of Vermont, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, Massachusetts Board of Libraries, New York Public Library, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Library, just to name a few. In addition to contract management, Matt has supervised and managed hundreds of individual mitigation and remediation projects and has responded to major disaster events across the country. He's experienced working with multiple types of archives and records, including various paper and film media, and he has presented educational webinars at several national events and is active in multiple industry associations. So with that, I will turn it over to Matt to begin our presentation.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. As Greg said, my name is Matt DeCirce, and I work for Polygon. I work out of the New York area, and my immediate region is the East Coast, but I do work with clients across the country. And I have a little presentation here to start, just to kind of give you an idea and some reference to what we'll be talking about today. And for those of you who may not have had or have had experienced a disaster or an event at your facility or any damage to your collections, I do have some pictures to help paint that picture and really bring that event to life for you here. And for those of you who may have been through one, this may bring up some bad memories. I hope everything is well now, and we can discuss maybe how you responded then, what you think maybe could have been done better on both ends, both vendors and with clients. And we can go through some more details about these services, both on the preparedness side and the recovery side. The first slide here is just an overview of what emergency vendors can provide. And typically their service offerings are split into two sides. You see here on the left would be the preparedness services. So those would be services that they would provide to you prior to an event happening or in preparation of those events happening. They can vary in detail and scope, but a few of those specific services that may be provided are site or risk assessments, walk through of facilities, finding high priority areas, high risk areas, maybe special collection areas, areas that maybe you've had damage in the past. All that can be put together, and a risk assessment can be provided that will help you kind of guide you through preparedness plans and any recovery that you may experience or need for. Part of that is an emergency preparedness profile, which is an exchange of information. A lot of emergency vendors will exchange information ahead of time, whether it's informal, just through basic, location, W-9 information, insurance information, or it can be more detailed in the form of a master service agreement where there's terms and conditions put in place. Pricing is usually agreed upon ahead of time. Maybe protocols are in place and scope of works are in place. So those are usually a little bit more detailed, but both of them provide essentially the same service, and it's developing that relationship with the vendor ahead of time and smoothing out all those wrinkles. So in the event that you may need them, both sides can kind of just get to the task at hand and not have to deal with any of the red tape that may exist between agencies and vendors. Part of the other part of preparedness services, and a big part, is the inventory development. Emergency service vendors may help you or work with you there. As you'll see in some of these pictures, a current and active inventory is crucial to the recovery phase. When materials are damaged, a lot of times that inventory can be lost, labels can be lost, and if there's not a system in place to identify those materials, it can really set you back from the beginning. So an inventory development is a huge part. Training and workshops are also a huge part. Even a webinar like this, just understanding and educating yourself on what's out there, the options to you, any new techniques or services that may be available. All of that is constantly evolving, just like any industry. So, to keep yourself updated is a big part of the preparedness service that emergency vendors provide. Project consulting. If you have a specific project in mind, a lot of the emergency service vendors like ourselves will provide free assessments or scope of works, and we'll work with you to come up with the best scope of work in terms of what they can provide and to meet the needs of that specific project. And the last one, it's fairly, it's been around, but it's also new in some areas, is remote climate monitoring. Having, using technology, using IoT and having it in place to monitor the conditions where your collections are, whether it be temperature, relative humidity, leak detection. Those conditions can be monitored now in real time and can really give you a blueprint or a projection of climate change in spaces that may lead to mold or other damage to your collections. So that's kind of on the preparedness side, and would be something that you can always work on and always evolve. The recovery services here, the list you see on the right side, is what can be provided in the event of what we would call a disaster, but that would mainly consist of a water damage, mold damage outbreak, in some cases fire damage. Typically when there's a fire, it's more smoke and water damage mix to those collections that weren't completely destroyed by the fire. And those services range, but they a lot of these emergency service vendors will provide all these same ones, and you see them there in order. The first one would be freezer stabilization. So in the event of a water damage to your materials, they're able to, whether it be mobile freezer storage, bringing it to the site, or permanent freezer storage at a facility. We have both, and a lot of emergency service vendors provide both, but that's the first step in a water damage situation, stabilizing the materials, stabilizing any secondary damage, and allowing you to make the decisions for the next phases of that project. The next phase, naturally, from freezer stabilization, if it's a water damage, is vacuum freeze drying. Those vacuum freeze drying chambers are in permanent space. So if that's a service that's needed, a lot of time the materials do have to come off site and be brought to a vendor's facility where they can be processed through these vacuum freeze drying chambers. Another option for drying, it's typically used for materials that may have sat wet for an extended period of time, several months or more, in some cases years, or specific types of materials may react better to what we call desiccant drying, which is, in that case, the materials do not need to be frozen. They can be dried in a desiccant drying chamber or room, which is typically digitally controlled and has a temperature of around 70 to 75 degrees and a relative humidity of around 25 to 30%. And materials can be dried in there through a process of handling and air movement in desiccant climate. The next service that can be provided for recovery is archive cleaning, or any type of cleaning. Typically, it's a surface cleaning, which is done with HEPA vacuum and soot sponges, and that will remove any debris that's left behind from the water damage, mold growth, or any dust or anything, dirt that may be left on those materials after the damage. So that's typically a service that's done after the drying is completed. Mold remediation is a service that can be standalone. There may be a mold outbreak in place, and for that process, materials are typically cleaned. All surface areas are cleaned, and then there is a sterilization option that can be used to eliminate any mold spores that may have penetrated into paper materials. Pest eradication is another one. There's a blast freezing process that's done to eliminate pests and larvae. And then the last service would be the deodorization process, which is typically done for materials that have suffered a smoke damage, that have that kind of heavy smoke odor that's latched onto it. Deodorization can be provided to remediate that. So that's just kind of a list or an overview of the capabilities that a lot of these service providers have for you, both on the preparedness and recovery side. We're all set there with, yep. So this is just kind of a little walkthrough to give you an idea of kind of what I see when I get a call out to a client's location. Some of your archives may look like this, or this next slide here, or even this next slide. But when I'm called in, they typically will look like, and this would be a worst case scenario, but this is the next slide here is an example of a flood damage. This is what I would call kind of the worst case scenario, or the extreme end of the spectrum. But those materials were under water, completely submerged in about 4 feet of water. As you see, there's not just water damage there, there's also mud or a residue that's left behind after that water. These materials were all completely salvaged. But I show this at the start of the presentation just to kind of, again, paint the picture of what these projects can look like at the extreme end. And as you're working with emergency vendors, I always tell our clients to plan for the worst for a situation like this and hope for the best. And if you're prepared for something like this, a smaller damage or a smaller incident in your facility, may be a little bit easier to handle and more manageable. So the purpose of working with an emergency service vendor prior to the event is so that you can respond efficiently and effectively to an emergency situation. Time is of the essence in these cases, especially with water damage. Secondary damage can occur in as little as 48 to 72 hours. This summer, I would say late summer, when we had high humidity here in the Northeast, I was seeing mold grow in about that time frame, about 48 to 72 hours on water damage materials. So having a plan in place allows you to respond quicker, to make those decisions that are needed, to make those approvals that are needed, to stabilize and triage these materials in the event of emergency, so that you can limit some of the secondary damage like mold or swelling or staining or cockling or whatever it may be to those materials. It's important to maintain a process for controlling custody through that, both internally at your organization and then also that transfer of custody to the vendor. How does that look? That's something you can discuss with them ahead of time. Typically, again, it relates back to that inventory. There's a good inventory in place. The vendor can create a list, what we call a working inventory. So it's a list of those actual materials that will be leaving the facility. They're approved and signed off on by both sides prior to leaving the facility. And you're controlling the custody there and monitoring and managing those materials that may leave. This one should probably be the first one, but prioritizing health and safety of everyone involved is the utmost important. These situations, depending on how bad they are and how much damage there is to the building, could really have some safety issues and some health hazards to everyone that may walk into that building. The first thing would be to make sure the building is clear by the code department to be occupied. The electricity is cleared so that there's not any loose wires hanging. The security has been cleared so that that any windows are shored up, broken doors are reattached. So you really want to make sure that the safety is a priority for yourself and for your staff and for everyone involved. Once that is secure and approved and everyone can go into work, then the next step would be recovering the materials that are damaged. Vetting vendors, something I've mentioned a couple times and is kind of the underlying theme of this webinar. Just having those relationships in place with vendors, I can say, go a long way in the event of emergency. It may not have to be something official where you have a contract in place. Maybe it's just a phone call every 6 months or an email just to update information back and forth. But I can say, having those relationships in place allow everything to go more seamlessly if you do need those vendors. And from a vendor standpoint, if those relationships are in place and there's a large scale event where there's multiple clients calling us at once for our services, we're going to lean towards and gravitate towards those relationships that are already established and those clients that we work with. Another thing too would be identify and isolate the problem area. If it's a widespread problem and it's the entire building, obviously, that wouldn't be the case. But if it's, possibly a room where maybe you move out any materials that have not been impacted, get them to safety, isolate them, and then just focus on those materials that are damaged. And allowing yourself to not cross-transfer any damage or any secondary damage to those materials. That's all set. And this is just a good illustration of the importance of that response time. These are two situations. These are real life scenarios that I worked in. This top one here, the picture in the top right, I received a call from a client and came out. That's actually a water damage. It's actually a sewage damage to materials that were in cabinets. And they called us the morning of, so around 8, 9 in the morning. We were able to respond within a few hours. We were there by noon, and by mid-afternoon, those materials were in a freezer stabilizing, and then we started to process them through the different services: vacuum, freeze drying, cleaning, and sterilization. And as you can see, as a result, they turned out well. They were all salvageable. And in terms of the condition and the return condition, we were happy with the standard that was there and the quality, and so was the client. And that, again, that's probably the best case scenario where everything works seamlessly. It was a customer that had a preparedness plan in place with us and a contract in place. So we had worked there prior. We knew the area. They knew us. and there was really no hiccups along the way to the response. So we were there pretty much as soon as you could be, and we're able to treat those materials immediately, and you can see the result. The bottom is kind of the opposite situation. I was called to a client and looked at the materials there on the left, and as you can see, there was just a small amount of mold on some of the folders on the inside, due to some processes that were in place with the client. There was a delay with them to start any processing on these materials, and they sat for a few months' time, probably closer to 6 months. I came back out on the second visit, and the same materials, as you can see there on the right, were completely engulfed with mold, and there was a widespread mold outbreak that needed to be remediated. So a smaller project turned into a larger one, which in turn just leads to increased costs, and a decreased quality of return from those materials, just because they have sat for so long damaged. They caused damage that maybe could have been avoided if they were processed sooner. And this is just a kind of a flow chart of what a typical project phase looks like. If you can kind of follow along here in the top left is what we would call the pack out, and other vendors use the same terms, but that's that process on site, identifying the materials that are damaged, creating the inventory and moving them off site to be processed, which would be that next site, that next phase there of transportation. Sometimes that's done in box trucks, vans, freezer trailers, but that is part of the process and is part of the pricing that's associated with these projects. The first phase, typically once those materials are put at a facility, is to enter them or to store them in what we call a blast freezer or freezer stabilization. Those freezers can vary in temperature. We usually keep ours around 20 to 25 degrees to stabilize water damaged materials. Once they're in there, you are limiting any secondary damage, and you're allowing yourself time to make decisions and that best fit the collection and the project moving forward. After the blast freezing, when materials are frozen, they go into the vacuum freeze drying chamber. The materials are processed in there inside the vacuum freeze drying chamber. And then once they're done drying, they're able to be handled without any worry of damage. And from there, there's what we would call secondary services that are available, depending again on the need of the materials and the direction of the customer. There's a sterilization option, which is gamma radiation, which will sterilize and kills 99.999% of all microbes, including mold. We typically will use gamma radiation after flood damage materials. Flood waters are what they classify as black water, and can contain everything from bacteria to bloodborne pathogens to sewage. So the sterilization process is typically used there, or can be used in some other cases for mold. And then after that, materials can go through a cleaning process, which would be remove any debris that's on the surface, or if there was any imaging or reproduction that's needed, that's typically when that would be done. And then the final banner there you see is we provide a quality control check if odor neutralization is needed, depending on the damage. Return preparation, where materials would be housed accordingly to the specs of the client, and then the return delivery, where they would be delivered back to the original location or to an alternate offsite storage location, again, depending on the need. Okay. And this is just a walkthrough pretty much with images of each one of those phases I just ran through, just to give you an idea of kind of what to expect if you are in a situation like this. This would be a pack out. As you can see the picture on the right there, there is some debris left that's in kind of in the middle of those boxes. That is actually how high the water was in that facility. It was over the file cabinet. This client actually moved the boxes on top of the file cabinets prior to the flood, preparing for it, and it still wasn't enough. So I think it also illustrates, sometimes you can be prepared as you can, or as needed, and Mother Nature has a different direction it wants to go, and that's when everything kind of pivots from the preparedness side and all the work you did before to now how do we recover these materials efficiently. And this is a good illustration of what it kind of looks like when you walk into some of these facilities that have a damage like that. The next slide here is what it looks like as they're prepped. As you can see, there's labels that are transferred to each side outside of the box. In some cases, they're put on with stickers. We typically find in a situation like this where it's a larger disaster, a larger damage, that writing directly on the boxes are the most efficient way. Stickers and with water damage materials and wet boxes can slide off, can be smudged, can move. So, this is our process, but you'll see a similar one throughout the industry with different vendors where materials are identified, they're cross-referenced on an inventory, and then they're put into housing to be transported, and then labels are typically transferred verbatim. In some cases, original labels are put inside each one of these boxes to match and to keep them together. And then you stage the materials like this. And then the next slide here, you'll see that, well, this is, I can touch on this. This is for special collections that may require a little bit more special handling. You can see wax paper in between there with books, spine down is always done. And typically as they're packed, they're compressed together as much as possible to keep them from swelling or cockling during the transport. Again, it depends on the project and the need of those collections, but this is also another option that we provide and other vendors provide as well. So this is what looks like when we start to pack the trucks. This was a large scale project. As you can see, boxes were staged. They're then palletized according to where they come out of. We try to group them together, whether it be by some identifier, either location in the building, if it's books, call numbers, whatever it is, we try to keep them in order. And once they're packaged and packed out, the materials are kept in the same order throughout the processing phases. Next slide. This is what they look like typically on a truck. Once they go from the boxes, they're palletized, they're secured on those pallets. This is actually a freezer trailer. So as you can see, there's a refrigeration unit that's up in the top there in the back. So these materials were being stabilized immediately on this truck. Typically on a freezer trailer, it's between about 25 to 35 degrees Fahrenheit. And we can start that freezer stabilization process during the transport, and that's what you're seeing here. This is the freezer stabilization or the freezer storage on site at a facility. It's one of ours on both sides there, but you can see they're moved into their large spaces. Materials are then staged there for a certain amount of time before they start the next phase of the vacuum freeze drying, which is a picture here, an image of one of our vacuum freeze drying chambers. Those materials go into that chamber frozen, and we can get into some more of the details of that if you have questions later. But yeah, those materials will go in as you see them in the boxes, again, in that same order, into the vacuum freeze drying chamber, where depending on their degree of damage and saturation, they're processed through cycles, typically about 2 5-day cycles, but again, it depends on the need of that certain project. And after the drying, this is the cleaning. We have a cleaning center where every surface area is cleaned by hand with HEPA vacuums and soot sponges to remove that debris. A lot of the other vendors provide a very similar process, and in some cases, that process can even be provided on site. But yeah, everything is handled, cleaned. In our case, under negative air. We use HEPA vacuums and HEPA filters in the cleaning center room itself, and then they're transferred over and housed into new housing for the return delivery. Then this is just a list of some of those secondary services. Again, I didn't want to go into too much detail on them because they're not always needed, but I wanted you to know that they are available and vendors do provide it. Gamma radiation and the mold remediation is a sterilization process. Odor neutralization, disinfecting, fogging can be done in the space itself. So after those materials are removed from a space, the shelving and the room itself can be disinfected. Scanning and digital imaging can be provided. Destruction, if any of those materials are marked for destruction or can be, shredding or incineration can be provided. And then pest eradication, again, is a process that is done through blast freezing in sub-zero temperatures. And depending on the damage to those materials or the need, that is something that can be included with a disaster situation or can be a standalone project. And that's all I have for the run through. I mean, just kind of a walkthrough of the services and the different phases that are available. We can get into them more, but I can turn it over here now to Maddie for the next step in the webinar.
Yeah, thanks so much, Matt. That was really helpful to see you walk through that with images and everything. I should say that you know, we work with a lot of organizations that are doing emergency planning and trying to prepare for these types of events. And we often talk to them about emergency service providers like Polygon. And we get a lot of questions about it. And so I reached out to Matt and we had a conversation that I thought was really great. And then we kind of wanted to make that conversation more open in this webinar form, because I think it's really awesome to have you here to kind of answer some of these questions about these service providers, because sometimes it can feel a little bit opaque. So I want to thank you for being here and doing that. And also to reiterate that, like, this is really everyone who's here participating. This is your time to ask questions of Matt and of myself, and I'll kind of get us started with some questions, but anything that you have to ask for the two of us, go ahead and put it in the chat, and Greg and I are going to try and stay on top of that. But one thing I wanted to ask just to get us started, Matt, you know, when you were going through a lot of the vacuum freeze drying and the cleaning and even some of the disinfection and those kind of processes, we were looking at pretty standard archives collections, paper-based collections. I'm wondering for, you know, the folks who might be here that have more mixed collections, that might have more special collections, some objects that might be maybe outside the scope of what Polygon, for example, can do when it comes to cleaning. Like, and I know that you do work with conservators sometimes to treat some of those objects. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about how you make those decisions about like what is stable enough to go through those processes and what needs to be sort of a larger discussion.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And what we always try to keep in mind is the well-being of the collection. You know, we are only going to provide services that the client understands fully and is on board with and approves of. With our cases, yeah, a lot of it is, you know, with the vacuum freeze drying, special collections can be a little bit different depending on what those actual materials are. And that's where there are some other options available, like the desiccant drying that I touched on. An example I think of is clay-coated books. They don't respond too well to the vacuum freeze drying just because of the density of the covers themselves. It kind of limits some of the evaporation of the water. So that's a material that if we see, we usually will have a conversation with the client and explain that to them, and then explain that we would be using a different process for them. And the same thing's true with, you know, film media, you know, any other type of special materials. What we try to do is identify it ahead of time, going back to that inventory, knowing what materials are where, assessing the damage of those materials, and then coming up with a scope of work based on what we can provide and what's best for those materials and what the customer is comfortable with. In terms of, you know, cleaning, we're very general cleaning. It's just a surface cleaning and more to remove anything that's been left behind from a water damage or a pest infestation. Anything that is specialized, yeah, we refer to conservators. You know, we like working with different conservators, whether it's using them as a resource, referring customers to conservators directly. Yeah, we kind of draw a line at anything outside of our scope, and in our point of view, refer to the experts who would be the conservation side of this process. So yeah, it's really a case by case basis, I would say, and depending on the need of the specific collection and what that collection is. So the priority is to identify what those materials are first, explain what our capabilities are with each individual material, and then explain kind of what is out of our scope so that that customer is aware of it. And when we get to that phase in the process, they can, you know, source what they need accordingly.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, I think we have a question in here. How can you help people who don't know the signs to look for, such as mold, water damage, etc.? Do you offer training for identification of issues?
It's a good question. We do offer trainings, not so much for identifying, but we would be happy to work with you. We have a lot of resources available to us. I have a lot of images, before and after pictures that are available that can be shared to kind of walk you through what water damage looks like, what mold damage may look like. We provide free risk assessments, and so do other service providers. So we can come out to the site and walk through if there's a specific area or a specific collection that you may have in mind, and kind of walk through and speak with you about what we look for and try to pass on some of that knowledge to you. So that would be the way. We don't have a specific training, but we're happy to work with you and share our knowledge with you in any aspect of this.
Yeah, and I'll just say from the Conservation Center, we have a few resources, a few recorded webinars on our YouTube page, and also a few resources in terms of like technical leaflets on our website that sort of help with mold identification. Just for some practical off the top of my head right now, something that we talk a lot when we're talking about identifying whether something has been damaged by water or has been affected by mold. When you're looking for water damage, it's pretty self-explanatory. You're looking for tide lines, you're looking for distortion of different materials. When it comes to mold, it's a little bit more complicated. Really what we're thinking about is like, are the conditions right for mold? Is there moisture available? Is there nutrition available for mold? And then, when you're looking at a spot on maybe the spine of a book and you're wondering whether it's mold or if it's something else, you really want to look for kind of the pinpoint center of that spore and then the little hyphae that radiate out from the center like fingers. And there's a lot more resources that we can definitely direct you to if you have more questions, but just a couple tips off the top of my head. Okay, so I definitely have a couple more questions for you, Matt. You mentioned a couple times desiccant drying, and you talked about how the process requires relatively low temperatures, I think like in the 70s, and low relative humidity. I know that emergency vendors that are maybe more commercial or focused on drying out architectural materials like drywall and stuff like that. I know there are a couple of desiccant drying processes that require really high heat. So I'm just wondering if the process that you use at Polygon is like specifically designed to keep that heat low, and maybe for the participants of the webinar, like what questions can you ask if you're talking to a service provider about desiccant drying? Because we definitely don't want to blast our collections with a lot of heat if we have the option not to.
Yes, yeah, and you're right. Building materials, drying, drywall, hardwood, gypsum, whatever it may be, dry at a higher heat. You have to force that evaporation point within those materials, and each one has a different one. Paper-based, especially special collections, yeah, we don't want to overbake any of the material. And because of that, we use a lower heat. It may go up until the 80s, depending kind of on what the humidity is outside and what we can keep the RH at. But the temperature will vary between 70 and 80, and we keep a low RH. And because of that, it's a longer time frame for drying. It may be extended out over the course of 3 or 4 weeks or more. It's a very tedious process with it too, because a lot of times when there's water damaged materials, they are bound together, stuck together through the water. We have technicians inside the desiccant chamber that by hand, will start to pull and peel those materials apart as they're drying, frame them, keep them in order on the shelves so that we limit some of the swelling that may exist. So it's a very tedious process, and I would ask them, if they are offering desiccant dehumidification, just ask them about their desiccant chamber or the desiccant room. In some cases, vendors have the full negative air, containment, digital control. In other cases, some vendors may say they have it, and it's, you know, more just a dehumidifier, maybe that with a tenting over it, like a plastic. So I would say the first thing would be ask about the facility itself where they do this, if they've done it in the past and their success rate. And then, yeah, I would say to ask about the climate itself and what their typical specs are for drying. You know, it's a process where we are, again, monitoring it daily and hourly, and in a lot of cases by the minute. So we're able to know if there are any changes, if we are over baking it, for lack of a better word, and if it is too hot, we can adjust that, you know, in real time because of the digital monitoring. So I would say to ask about the location, to ask about the monitoring of the climate, you know, if it's done digitally, if it's done, you know, do they just put them in a room and let them sit there for 2 weeks and then come back? And then, yeah, their experience with that in the past. Every material is a little bit different. Every project's a little bit different. So we rely in some cases on the experience of our project managers, with similar projects, and knowing, you know, what the best temperature is for that material and what the best climate is for that material.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I think another good reminder that when you're kind of vetting these organizations ahead of time, ideally, because you have a lot of time to ask all these questions, but just asking questions about all the different processes, because there's a couple different ways you can do freezing. There's a couple different ways you can do desiccant drying, and making sure that you understand exactly what's going on and what the quality control is there seems like an important thing for that sort of pre-event process. We have a couple other questions in the chat. Here's one. What's the best way to connect with a rep who's closest to the area where my institution is located?
There's a couple ways. You know, there's obviously Google, you know, the answer to everything. But I would say if you want to look for kind of source vendors, NARA has a website with registered vendors that are on there. I think there's a list of about 6 or 7 that they've vetted, that can be resourced. Or depending on where you are, individual states, state archives or state record center may have vendors in place that have been sourced that they use, on kind of a rotational basis. So I would say start with NARA and maybe some of the governing agencies in your area, and also the Google search. Or if you are interested, I can send over a list too as well. You know, that they're out there. But yeah, I would say to probably start with NARA and anything that may be local to you. If you're in a large county, some counties have vendors that are on file. You know, maybe start there, because typically any of these vendors that are registered or vetted by the government have gone through a stringent background check where, you know, all the financial information is exchanged, service capabilities, pricing, terms and conditions. They've kind of done a lot of that work for you. So it's a good place to start.
Yeah, that's a really good tip. I've never considered that, but maybe even reaching out to like your state historical society or state archive or something, and seeing if they have any recommendations for folks that they've worked with in the past.
And I would say also industry organizations, Council of State Archives, SAA, AIC. They have vendors that they've that have been involved with those groups for a long period of time that they may be able to refer you to.
Okay, here's a question from Susie Anderson. We have a designated emergency response vendor that would probably have access to the collection long before our special collections team will. Do you have any suggestions for working with those more standard disaster response companies, trying to figure out what we can pre-plan and also what is realistic when an emergency occurs?
Yes, I would say to ask them, you know, if they do provide this service. Some of the larger ones do, and they're a full service. We are not. You know, we're a little more specialized, but some of them do, and they're very good at what they do. So I would say the first question would be to ask them if they handle it in-house, or how do they handle that. In some cases, they subcontract it to a company like ours, depending on who it is. Just kind of find out that process first, and then I would also say, because you are more specialized in what your need is with the collections, possibly coming up with a protocol. If they're going to be on site first, prior to your team, you know, maybe there's a specific way you want materials handled or assessed. You know, a protocol on replies or feedback to you, questions maybe that you can ask them, or give them a list of, you know, inspection points. You know, maybe check this room, go through our special collections here. You know, or even exchange an inventory ahead of time so they know where materials are that may be of high risk or of high value. So yeah, I would say just to ask questions on them and their capabilities or their experience in the past, and then maybe provide a protocol specific to how you want your materials handled.
Yeah, that's a great point. Definitely making sure you're asking questions about whether different services are subcontracted out, which you mentioned. That's really good to point out. We also generally recommend when folks are working on their emergency plans for their collections, it can be really helpful to sort of define some of those salvage priorities that are going to be, your number ones. If an emergency happens, what are the things you want to check on first, and kind of calling those out pretty early on in the emergency plan, even putting a picture of them in the emergency plan, just so that you can sort of hand off that list of salvage priorities with locations and images to anyone who might be accessing your collection before you get access to it. That way, if folks that aren't you and don't maybe necessarily know that your founding documents is stored in the top drawer of the flat file, and that's the thing you're most worried about, it's easier for them to get access to it. Okay, let's see what other questions. So one of the questions I had was about communication, because communication can be so important in the event of an emergency. And I know it can get kind of complicated when you're working with outside vendors to maintain consistent communication. So I'm just wondering how that's handled, and maybe you can just use Polygon as an example. Like, say I work at an archive and we've had a sort of mid-sized water event, and we're working with Polygon to do a freeze drying project. Do I have a specific person that I'm going to be communicating with at Polygon? Like, what level of communication are we having across the course of the project?
Yeah, and that's very important, and I'm glad you asked, because communication is crucial for this. And I would also say continual communication. These projects, in terms of a time frame, aren't normally quick. So usually a normal process will take as long as 4 to 6 weeks. So there is an extended period of time where you'll be without your collection. So yeah, that communication and that relationship with that vendor is important. And in our case, we like to assign one person as a point of contact. So that would be the person that you would call with the emergency or the need. They would come out, perform the assessment, and then work with you on any type of the scope of work or the proposal or any type of funding that may be needed. And then they would be the person that keeps you updated throughout the process. What we like to do is kind of give you an update. If you can remember back to the slide I had with the different phases, we like to update you at pretty much each time those materials move from phase to phase. So when we get to the freezer, to the drying, yeah, if you can go back, yeah. So the pack out would be the first call. Obviously the transportation to our facility, but they would go into the freezer. So we generally will notify you when they arrive. So if it's the same day, if it's traveling long distance where it's maybe a day later, we would say they have arrived. They've been placed in the freezer. We're going to start vacuum freeze drying on this day. And then as they complete each one of these stages, we'd like to send an update. And these are projects that can change. The scope of work can change depending on the need, depending on both the outcome from the drying. Some materials maybe they couldn't be dried or they were too far damaged, and once we get them out of the chamber, maybe you don't want some of these secondary services. So we'd like to update you pretty much every step of this process, to stay in touch with you, one, to let you know how the materials are progressing, and to see if there's any other needs, or if there's any revisions to the scope of work as we work through it. So I would say it's important to have one point of contact, and then updates throughout this process, because again, it's not something that's completed within a week. These materials could be away from your facility for months at a time, depending on the size of the project.
Yeah, definitely. Another question I had is just a question that I get a lot, especially when I'm talking to folks about mold. Maybe they've had a pretty contained water event, maybe like condensation leak from an HVAC system that's caused a little bit of mold in the collection. And a question I get a lot is like, how do I know when the event is big enough that I need to call in an emergency service provider? Do you have any tips for folks who are asking those questions?
Yeah, and I wish I had a definitive answer, but it is sometimes a gray area, or it can go either way. What we say is, depending on the capabilities of the client, in a lot of cases they can handle certain sizes, size damage or size cleaning projects with mold remediation. I would say if you're starting to find it where it's more widespread, it's not contained to one area, one shelf, one section of a shelf, but you're finding it throughout stacks. What we do in a situation like that is perform an assessment, a complete assessment, kind of an inspection of all the materials to find where that mold has spread. And if that's something, some organizations are bigger and have the people and the staff to do that on their own. Some don't. Some are one person working and handling a collection. So I think it depends on your capabilities and the size of your organization. We can assist kind of anywhere throughout that process. Where you need us, we're available, and so are the other service vendors. But I would say it kind of depends on what you can handle, what you've handled in the past. And if you start to feel overwhelmed or it's something that you can't handle, then yeah, that's the point to call somebody.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll also mention that from the conservation side, there's a couple resources that are available to you in that sense. You can always reach out to us at the Conservation Center. You can also reach out to the National Heritage Responders, which is an organization through the American Institute for Conservation, and they have a hotline where they're happy to, it's manned by conservators that are trained specifically in emergency response, and they're happy to talk through these questions with you. Yeah, I think if you're feeling uncomfortable, just reaching out and having a conversation and bringing in as much help as you can to just help make those decisions is often a good way to go.
Yeah, I agree.
We're getting close to the end of our time here, so I just want to remind all of our participants, if you have any last minute questions, please throw them in the chat, because otherwise I'm just going to keep selfishly asking my questions, and hopefully they touch on some of the things that you're curious about. But I do have another one about blast freezing versus regular freezing. You mentioned those freezer trucks that have on the higher end of freezing temperatures, and blast freezing is much lower temperatures. What's the benefit of blast freezing over just regular freezing?
Yes. So so there are various temperatures depending on the degree of damage and the need of the collections. What we've found with freezer trailers, when it's a mobile, it is very difficult to maintain a temperature under 30 degrees while a tractor trailer is, rolling down a highway in the summer. So that's why it tends to be a little bit on the high end. We try to keep it as close as we can to freezing. So sometimes it's right around 30 degrees when it's mobile. When materials are at a facility, you obviously have more control, more containment on the freezer, more efficient. We like to freeze materials between 20 and 25 degrees prior to drying them, and that would be water damage materials. We found that in some cases, you can overfreeze materials, whether it be by length of time that they've stayed in the freezer. Typically, 2 to 3 months. We try to recommend a decision or a movement from the freezer after about 3 months, because condensation can form, and just like in your own freezer, there can be freezer burn on the outside of collections. And if it's frozen at a too low of a temperature, that same process can occur. The times that we use blast freezing or sub-zero is typically specifically for pest eradication, where materials are placed into freezers that are down as low as -25 to -30 degrees Fahrenheit. And what that has been found is that will eliminate pest and larvae over the course of 3 separate cycles. So the materials will cycle through at that sub-zero temperature, typically for about 4 days. Then they're acclimated back to room temperature or 70 degrees, and then they're placed back into that sub-zero cycle again. And 3 cycles has been proven to eliminate pests. So that's typically when we get that low. If it's anything that's sub-zero, for us at least, it's typically for pest eradication. Anything that's about 20 to 25 degrees Fahrenheit is for water damage, remediation, and drying.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that definitely makes sense. We have a question. Can you describe your deodorization process for smoke damaged materials?
Yes, so deodorization can be difficult to do depending on the materials. Again, we have kind of a separate room where we have desiccant dehumidifiers in there that will pull out any moisture or extract moisture out. And then we use it's under negative air, so the room itself is under negative air, and there's a HEPA filtration and additional filtration units on the main HVAC system for the room, so that the thought or the process is that the air is cycled through the filters. It's extracted out through the dehumidifiers and air scrubbers. It's cycled through the HEPA filtration, and over time, it is a lengthy process that odor starts to lessen. A lot of it will be caught up in the charcoal filters that we use. So it's kind of a series of filters and air filtration with these materials inside that room that eliminate some of these odors.
Gotcha. So you're not applying anything to the collections themselves. It's just
No,
it's an air filtration.
it's an air filtration. No, we do have that option, but yeah, with our experience, a lot of clients do not want that. There are the different, you can do the different scented air filters so that you can add a scent. But from our standpoint, again, we try to keep the well-being of the collection in mind. So we don't typically add much. All of our cleaning is dry cleaning. We don't do any type of liquid cleaning or wet cleaning. And in this case too, yeah, we don't add any fragrances. It's all natural just through an air filtration process.
Yeah, and that's something that we would recommend on the conservation side, not applying anything to collections to deodorize them, not adding any scent or anything like that. So a good reminder that that's a great question to ask your vendor if you are opting into a deodorization process. Okay, it's 12:57, so we just have a couple of minutes left. I'm wondering if Greg, you might forward our slides to the one that has Matt's and my contact information. Just because, and Matt, I'm volunteering you here, but you should feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. Yeah, I just want to thank you so much for being here and kind of letting me and our participants pick your brain about this stuff. It's really helpful, I think, to kind of be transparent about these processes, because no one wants to be in a situation where they need to bring in an emergency vendor, but unfortunately sometimes it does happen. So yeah, thanks so much.
Well, thank you for having me. It's my pleasure. And yeah, I'm happy to help anyone if they have questions. You can use us as a resources. A lot of our preparedness services are free of charge. So if you need resources, site assessments, emergency preparedness plan templates, we're happy to help. Please feel free to reach out.
Yeah, just want to reiterate huge thanks to you, Matt, and to you, Maddie, for speaking with us today. I also want to thank Camilla Dawson, who's been working behind the scenes with all of the tech and setup for today's webinar. Thanks again to the National Endowment for the Humanities, the William Penn Foundation, and the Independence Foundation, and to everyone in the audience today. Thank you for showing up. So our next webinar is going to be Archives Are Not Neutral. I'll just leave you with that title on November 29th at noon. So we're going to be posting more information on our website soon about that. So check back there for more, and we hope to see you there. And when this program ends, you'll see a little survey that will pop up after your window closes. We kindly ask that you fill this out to let us know how we're doing. And we'll be providing lots of resources after the webinar, more about how to get in touch with Matt and Polygon, and just more about emergency vendors. So thank you, everybody, for coming today, and hope you all have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy your day.
Thanks. Bye-bye.